All throughout history, we have seen the concept of what is known as the other played in different groups of people. People were viewed as the other based on different traits such as race, gender, and now even sexuality. The other is a concept referring to those who appear radically different because their customs or worldview challenge to the point of violating what people may hold to be universal laws. In our class, we have discussed two differing concepts, physical other side as well as cultural other side. Other side is the notion of human equality contingent on the effacement of difference through the assimilation to universal values. Throughout the history of the U.S., the concept of the other has been demonstrated against other different types of groups. Typically, politics has been used as a balancing act. We see this being used against just about every different minority group, juxtaposed against the dominant group. In the context of this class, we discussed the philosophy of the other, particularly within the colonization of the Americas. Within the realm of political science, cultural other side can be seen as the destruction of thousands of indigenous cultures, for example, rationalized violence to the other's identity, whereas physical other side is represented in the annihilation of the other, in particular the genocide of the Native Americans, in respect to the concept of manifest destiny. Due to radical differences in physical appearances and cultural practices between Native Americans and European Americans, Native Americans were among the first group to be viewed as the other in colonization of the Americas. Native American culture was viewed as intolerable because of certain practices such as cannibalism. Some Native American tribes practiced cannibalism, which violated the universal values in respect to the idea of morality and Western ideology. Because this view of cannibalism was culturally unaccepted by Europeans, they felt the obligation and the right to civilize the other, which is commonly known as the concept of the white man's burden. In other words, evangelization as well as the civilizing mission. The very first few descriptions of Native Americans helped set the tone for how they would be viewed by the rest of the world with respect to the conquest of the Americas. This description was basically one that viewed them as bad, evil, irrational, uncivilized, barbaric, intolerable, and menacing. Thus began the systematic dehumanization of Native Americans as a people, which created a philosophical space for inegalitarianism. Africans were the next group of people viewed as the other. Within American society during the 16th century, Africans were originally brought to the Americas by Dutch traders as indentured servants. However, because society soon viewed this form of labor as too costly, Africans were systematically enslaved as people, and thus slave status became hereditary from the colonial time period into post-colonial times. This reflects the idea of the master to slave relationship, which is basically the white man dehumanizing Africans and viewing slaves as property. In addition to race, the concept of the other also plays out in gender differences, where women are viewed as inferior to men. For example, menstruation used to be viewed as dirty and evil, so women who were menstruating were removed from society and sent to these period shacks until they were done with menstruation. The concept of otherness can also be reflected in perceptions of sexual minorities. Since homosexuality does not have any reproductive means, it seems to violate the universal law of nature and mankind. As homosexuality is radically different in a society where heterosexuality is the norm, people initially thought that homosexuality is caused by evil spirits. Homosexuality was also thought of as a mental disorder because it went against dominant ideology that there has to be something wrong with gay people for them to be homosexual. Even now, people are still debating whether gay people have the right to marriage. Seeing how people have been viewed as the other based on traits such as race, gender, and sexuality, I would like to explore the concept of otherness further by examining the perception of Asian Americans Being a member of an ethnic minority in the US, I chose this topic because it is personally relevant to myself. Growing up in a predominantly white neighborhood, I always experienced this concept of the other. For example, even in elementary social science classes, the main message I took from what the history books we were reading at the time was that China, having the biggest population, was a menacing problem to the rest of the world as well as the environment. Looking at it from an alternative perspective, the Chinese are an industrious nation concerned with accommodating to the rest of the world's labor needs for the sake of efficiency. After experiencing this sort of upbringing, I made it a personal mission to discover what may have caused this sort of attitude towards people of my ethnic background. In this video, we will explore the concept of otherness and how Asian Americans are viewed as perpetual foreigners. In the context of the colonization of the Americas, Eurocentric ideals are viewed as dominant and superior. As a result, we typically see various ethnic minority groups having to assimilate to the dominant culture in order to be accepted in American society. According to Gary Okihiro, an Asian American scholar, anti-Asian sentiments have existed throughout history and can be traced back to their writings in the 4th century BCE. Asians were typically depicted as exotic, weird, repulsive, and even inhumane as if they were another species. Due to a vast difference in culture, environment, and physical appearance, early European accounts of Asian were exotic and alienating at the same time. Asians were viewed as inferior, in which Westerners were supposed to dominate them and give Asians a new identity. These deep-rooted views against Asians have shaped the Asian American experience before Asians even came to America. Even though many of these views were conceived numerous centuries ago, some of these views and misconceptions about Asians still exist today and continue to shape the Asian American experience. Westerners have long used the Chinese to benefit themselves. The origin of Asian American immigrants came from the need for cheap labor to build the railroads in order to help the developing America under the idea of manifest destiny. The American locals came to despise the Chinese immigrants for willing to work at low wages and viewed them as a threat. These anti-Chinese sentiments eventually led to the Chinese Exclusion Act. The European immigrants were more welcome and were able to assimilate, but the Chinese stood out due to differences in race and culture. Presently, Americans are still using the Chinese for cheap labor by outsourcing jobs, thus proving that even in today's world, the Chinese are viewed as the other. We can even see two differing ethnic minority groups being pinned against each other. For example, in the court case of Gong Lung versus Rice. A parent argued that his daughter should not have to carry the burden of attending school with blacks. Chinese immigrants used the 14th Amendment against blacks. They proclaimed that they deserve equal protection from danger of associating with black children. This is a strong example of the sentiment towards African Americans to the extent of Asian Americans not even wanting to do anything with this ethnic minority group in an effort to better assimilate into American society, thus reflecting the concept of the other. Anti-Asian prejudice affected men and women differently. Shakespeare portrayed Asian men as crude and dangerous beasts who sought to impregnate white women. Okihiro mentioned that many Westerners saw Asian men as cowards who lacked courage. Asian men were also viewed as inferior because they were not as masculine as European men. A similar notion still exists in popular culture today. Asian men are often depicted as the least desirable sexual partner due to the stereotype that Asian men have small genitals. While Asian men were demasculinized, Asian women were exoticized and objectified. Early accounts of Asian women describe them as exotic and delicate. An example of this is demonstrated in early accounts of Greek men's easy conquest of Asian women, which regards Asian women as objects that can be purchased rather than as human beings. In the media, Asian Americans usually play the supporting role. These roles are usually very limiting and reinforce the idea of the other. Asian Americans in the media play the roles of a foreigner, villain, or a nerd. Basically, these roles were all kind of weird and have some sort of negative connotation. Through previous anti-Asian immigrant policy and portrayals of Asian Americans in the media, we see how the concept of the other plays out in the perception of Asian Americans. Within the context of this class, and as a life lesson, it is important to be tolerant of each other, and also to realize the potential explosiveness of difference in a world in which interaction with the other is an inevitable and fundamental component of our existence. As the world becomes more globalized and technology becomes more advanced, there are more opportunities for us to interact with people that look different and come from a different cultural background. Rather than perpetuate this idea of the other, perhaps we should be accepting of each other's differences and cultures. Just by understanding Asian Americans' grievances from being perceived as the other, this can help us rethink the ways we deal politically with differences.